"Stop the concert, please. Jimin, look at me." Suga's voice cut through the roaring stadium, so unexpectedly that even the music seemed to disappear for a heartbeat. Under the blinding white lights, Jimin stood frozen at center stage, tears streaming down his face as thousands of army watched in stunned silence. He tried to smile, but his lips trembled. Suga stepped closer, ignoring the cameras, the producers, and the frantic signals coming from backstage. "You don't have to pretend anymore," he whispered. Jimin suddenly lowered his head, covering his face as the crowd erupted into confused screams. But why was Suga the only person who seemed to understand what had just happened? And what if the tears everyone thought were about the concert were actually connected to someone standing quietly behind the stage? If you were there, would you want Suga to stop the show, or let Jimin finish what he had started? Tell me what you would have done. The stadium had been loud long before the first note was played. Outside the enormous venue, the evening air carried the restless energy of thousands of fans waiting behind barriers, holding light sticks, banners, handmade letters, and photographs they had spent days preparing. Inside, the atmosphere was different but no less intense. Technicians moved between cables and equipment, stagehands checked microphones, dancers rehearsed their positions, and members of the production crew spoke rapidly into headsets as the final countdown approached. Every detail had been planned with almost military precision. The lights had been programmed to change at exact moments. The screens had been synchronized with the music. Cameras had been assigned to specific angles. Even the pauses between songs had been carefully measured. Yet nobody could have planned for what would happen later that night. Hours before the concert began, Jimin had been sitting alone in a quiet corner of the backstage area, still wearing his rehearsal clothes, his hands wrapped around a paper cup that had already gone cold. The room around him was unusually calm. Through the walls, he could hear the muffled sound of the audience arriving, thousands of distant voices blending into one low vibration. He stared at the cup for several seconds without drinking from it. Suga eventually noticed him. He had just returned from a production meeting, carrying a small notebook filled with handwritten notes about the night's performance. He stopped near the doorway but didn't immediately say anything. He had learned over the years that there were moments when asking, "Are you okay?" could make someone automatically answer, "I'm fine," even when they weren't. Instead, Suga leaned against the wall and quietly watched him. Jimin finally looked up. "You came back," he said. "Obviously," Suga replied. "You thought I escaped." Jimin gave a faint laugh. It was almost convincing. Almost. Suga walked over and sat beside him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Somewhere down the hallway, Jungkook was laughing loudly with one of the dancers. Jin's voice could be heard teasing someone near the wardrobe area. RM was discussing the sequence of the opening stage with a producer. J-Hope was moving between rooms, checking on the members and staff with his usual energy, while V stood in front of a mirror adjusting his outfit. Everything seemed normal. That was precisely what made Jimin's silence feel so noticeable. "You haven't eaten much," Suga said eventually. Jimin looked down at his cup. "I'm not hungry. That's what you said yesterday." "I know." Suga turned toward him. "And the day before," Jimin didn't answer. A faint smile appeared on Suga's face, but there was concern behind it. "You're terrible at lying." Jimin looked at him. "I'm not lying." "Exactly, you're avoiding the question." Jimin exhaled slowly and leaned back against the chair. For a moment he looked exhausted rather than sad. There was something deeper beneath his expression, something he hadn't found the words to explain. "It's just a strange day," he finally said. Suga didn't push. "Strange how?" Jimin's eyes moved toward the hallway. "I don't know." Another silence followed. Then someone called Jimin's name from outside, reminding him that the next rehearsal would begin in 10 minutes. Jimin stood immediately. "I should go." Suga watched him walk away. "Jimin," he stopped. "What?" Suga's voice softened. "If something's wrong, you don't have to explain it right now." Jimin stared at him for a moment. "I know." Then he walked away. Suga remained seated for another few seconds, looking toward the empty doorway. He couldn't explain why, but something about Jimin's expression stayed with him. It wasn't ordinary pre-show anxiety. It wasn't exhaustion. It was the expression of someone trying very hard to keep a door closed because they were afraid of what might happen if they opened it. The rehearsal began shortly afterward. Under the harsh white lights of the empty stage, Jimin moved exactly as expected. Every step was precise. Every turn landed where it should. His voice was steady. His smile appeared at the right moments. If someone had watched from the audience seats, they would have seen nothing unusual. But Suga was standing at the side of the stage and he noticed the tiny details. Jimin looked toward the far left section of the audience seats several times, even though there was nobody there. During one transition, he missed a cue by less than a second. Nobody else seemed to care. Jimin immediately corrected himself. Suga noticed. After rehearsal, the members gathered backstage. Jungkook was joking about one of the choreography changes. Jin complained dramatically about the temperature of the room. J-Hope laughed while discussing the opening sequence with the dancers. RM reviewed the set list one more time. V was scrolling through messages on his phone. Jimin sat slightly apart from everyone else. He wasn't isolated exactly. He was physically present, listening, occasionally smiling, occasionally answering. But his attention seemed somewhere else. Then a staff member entered carrying a small envelope. Jimin looked up. Yes, the staff member hesitated. Someone left this for you. Jimin frowned. For me? Yes. The envelope was plain, no name, no logo, no obvious indication of who had delivered it. Jimin accepted it carefully. Suga noticed the change in his expression immediately. What's that? Jimin looked at the envelope for several seconds. I don't know. He turned it over. Nothing. Maybe it's from a fan. Jungkook suggested. Jimin nodded, but he didn't open it. He simply held it between both hands. You okay? RM asked. Yeah, that familiar answer again. Jimin placed the envelope inside his bag. I'll look at it later. Nobody questioned him. The evening continued. Wardrobe checks began. Makeup artists moved between rooms. Security personnel reviewed entrances. Producers tested the microphones. The enormous screens above the stage displayed the opening graphics. Outside, the crowd grew louder with every passing minute. From backstage, the sound felt almost unreal. Thousands of people were waiting for a few hours that would eventually become a memory. For the members, however, it was another performance in a long chain of performances, another night where they would step onto a stage and try to give everything they had. But for Jimin, something about this particular night felt different. He couldn't explain why. Shortly before the opening, he finally opened the envelope. Suga happened to be nearby when he did. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. Jimin read the first line. His expression changed instantly. The color seemed to leave his face. Suga took one step toward him. Jimin? Jimin didn't respond. He continued reading. His eyes moved slowly across the page, and by the time he reached the final sentence, his fingers had begun to shake. Who wrote it? Suga asked quietly. Jimin folded the paper immediately. Nobody. Suga stared at him. That's not an answer. Jimin forced a smile. It's nothing. He put the letter away. But this time, Suga didn't believe him. There was something written on that page that had reached a part of Jimin he had been carefully protecting. And although Suga didn't yet know what it was, he understood one thing. Whatever was waiting for Jimin beyond those backstage doors was no longer something Jimin could simply leave behind. The stage lights suddenly changed from white to deep blue. A voice announced the beginning of the show. The members gathered in position. Jimin took one final breath. Suga stood beside him. Their shoulders almost touched. Ready? Suga asked. Jimin looked straight ahead. Yeah, Suga studied his face. Really? Jimin hesitated. Then, barely loud enough for Suga to hear, he answered, I have to be. The doors opened. The roar of the stadium crashed over them like a wave. Thousands of light sticks moved together, creating a sea of shimmering lights that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The members stepped forward. Jimin smiled. The cameras found him. The crowd screamed his name. And from that moment onward, nobody watching from the audience could have known that beneath the perfect smile was a folded letter, a secret he hadn't told anyone, and a quiet fear that would eventually follow him onto the stage. The first songs passed beneath a storm of lights, sound, and movement, and for several minutes Jimin managed to become exactly what everyone expected him to be. His smile returned. His movements were sharp. His voice carried across the stadium with the confidence of someone who had performed under pressure countless times before. From the audience, there was no obvious sign that anything was wrong. Every time the cameras found him, he gave ARMY the expression they had come to recognize. Warm, playful, almost impossibly bright. But Suga kept watching. He noticed that Jimin rarely looked toward the side of the stage anymore. He noticed the way Jimin's fingers tightened around the microphone whenever the music became quiet. He noticed something else, too. During one song, when the enormous screens behind them showed thousands of fans holding handwritten messages, Jimin suddenly stopped smiling for half a second. It was barely noticeable. A blink, a breath. Then he recovered, but Suga had seen it. The letter was still in Jimin's mind, and whatever it contained was becoming harder for him to hide. The next transition brought the members closer together. Jungkook leaned toward Jimin and shouted something over the music that made him laugh. Jimin responded naturally, and for a moment Suga wondered if perhaps he had been overthinking everything. Maybe Jimin really was fine. Maybe the strange expression backstage had simply been exhaustion. Maybe the letter wasn't important. Then Jimin looked toward the far end of the stadium again. This time, Suga followed his gaze. Near a restricted entrance, several staff members were standing beside a security barrier. Behind them, almost hidden by shadows and equipment, stood a young woman wearing a simple gray hoodie. She wasn't holding a light stick. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't trying to get closer to the stage. She was simply watching. Suga looked back at Jimin. Jimin had already turned away. The moment was gone, but something had changed. During the next break, Jimin walked toward the side of the stage and took a sip of water. Suga approached him. "Who is she?" Jimin's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who?" "The person near the restricted entrance." Jimin remained silent. Suga waited. "You saw her." Jimin looked down at his bottle. "I didn't know she would be here." That sentence answered more than Jimin intended. "Who is she?" Suga asked again, quieter this time. Jimin swallowed. "Her name is Hana." Suga waited for an explanation. None came. "She's someone I met before." "Before when?" Jimin looked toward the stage. "A few months ago." "And the letter?" Jimin's fingers tightened around the bottle. "It's from her." Suga didn't immediately respond. The noise from the audience filled the silence between them. "What does she want?" Jimin's voice dropped. "She doesn't want anything." "Then why are you afraid?" Jimin looked at him. That question landed harder than Suga expected. Jimin's expression softened, and for the first time that night he stopped pretending. "Because I promised her something." Suga waited. Jimin continued slowly. "I met her outside a rehearsal facility one night. He was sitting alone near the entrance. She wasn't trying to get inside. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just sitting there." "Why?" She had been performing at a small theater nearby. The theater was closing. She had lost her job. Her mother was sick. She told me she didn't know whether she should keep trying. Suga listened without interrupting. "I talked to her for maybe 20 minutes, Jimin continued. "That's all. But before I left, she said something I couldn't forget." "What did she say?" Jimin looked toward the crowd. "She said, 'People like me disappear quietly. Nobody notices until it's too late.'" Suga's expression changed. Jimin lowered his voice. "I told her she wasn't invisible." The next words came out almost like a confession. "I told her that if she ever felt like giving up, she should remember that someone believed she could keep going." Suga looked at him carefully. "And now she thinks I forgot." The music began again, signaling that the next performance was about to start. Jimin immediately straightened. "We have to go." Suga didn't move. "Jimin," he looked back, "you don't owe her your life." Jimin nodded. "I know." "Then why are you carrying this like you do?" Jimin's eyes became wet. "Because she believed me." Before Suga could answer, Jimin stepped back onto the stage. The lights rose. The crowd erupted again. But now Suga understood what he was seeing. Jimin wasn't simply nervous. He was carrying the weight of a promise he believed he had failed to keep. The performance continued, but the emotional distance between Jimin and Suga had changed. Suga stayed closer, not obviously, not enough for the audience to notice. But whenever Jimin moved toward the edge of the stage, Suga remained within reach. Whenever Jimin's expression faltered, Suga looked toward him. The others gradually sensed it too. RM noticed Suga's repeated glances. J-Hope noticed Jimin becoming quieter between songs. Jungkook noticed that Jimin barely touched the food brought backstage during the next break. Even Jin, who usually used humor to break tension, eventually stopped joking. Nobody knew the entire story, but they could tell something was happening. During a short backstage transition, RM approached Suga. "What's going on?" Suga shook his head. I don't know everything yet, but something is wrong. Suga looked toward Jimin, who was speaking with a staff member several meters away. He's worried about someone. RM followed his gaze. The woman, Suga nodded. RM's expression became serious. Do we need to do something? Not yet. Are you sure? Suga paused. No. That honesty made RM understand the seriousness of the situation. Meanwhile, Jimin had asked a staff member whether Hana could remain in the designated area safely. The staff member assured him that security was monitoring the restricted entrance. Jimin thanked them. But when he turned around, he saw Hana looking directly at him. Their eyes met across the distance. She didn't smile. She simply placed one hand over her heart. Jimin froze, then she slowly shook her head. It was a tiny movement, almost impossible for anyone else to interpret, but Jimin understood. She was telling him not to worry about her. And somehow that made everything worse. Because people who truly need help often become experts at saying they don't. The next song began. It was slower. The stadium lights dimmed, leaving thousands of small lights glowing throughout the audience. Jimin walked toward the center of the stage. The instrumental began softly. He lifted his microphone. For several seconds, everything was calm. Then he saw something on the giant screen behind him. The production team had switched to audience footage. Faces appeared one after another. Fans crying, fans smiling, friends holding hands. Parents standing beside their children. Someone holding a sign about surviving a difficult year. Someone else holding a handwritten message that simply said, "Thank you for staying." Jimin stared at the screen. His breathing changed. The words from Hana's letter suddenly returned to him. He remembered the first line. He remembered the final sentence. He remembered the promise he had made. But there was one detail he had not told Suga. The letter wasn't asking Jimin for help. It was saying goodbye. Hana had written that she had decided to leave the city, abandon performing, and stop believing that her life could change. She hadn't blamed Jimin. That was what hurt the most. She had simply written that she hoped he wouldn't feel responsible. Jimin had read those words backstage and realized that the person he had promised not to let disappear was standing only meters away from him, believing that she already had. His eyes filled again. He tried to continue singing. The first words came out correctly. Then his voice weakened. The audience grew quieter. Jimin looked toward the side of the stage. Suga was there. Their eyes met. Jimin tried to smile. Suga didn't smile back. He simply nodded as if saying, "You don't have to hide it from me." Jimin looked down. A tear fell onto the stage floor. He wiped his cheek quickly, but another followed. The music continued beneath him. The crowd didn't understand yet. Some thought he was overwhelmed by the atmosphere. Others began shouting his name. Jimin took a breath and tried to sing again. His voice broke. This time there was no hiding it. He lowered the microphone. The stadium became almost completely silent. Suga took one step forward. Jimin shook his head slightly as though asking him not to come. But Suga knew that gesture wasn't rejection. It was fear. Fear that if someone touched him, everything he had been holding back would finally collapse. Then Hana moved near the restricted entrance. Security noticed immediately and tried to stop her from approaching the stage area. Jimin saw the movement. His eyes widened. The letter, the promise, the woman he had met months earlier, the possibility that she might leave without believing anyone cared. Everything collided at once. Jimin's shoulders began to shake. He covered his face with one hand. The stadium erupted in confused cries. Suga stopped looking at the audience and looked only at Jimin. In that instant, he understood something that nobody else did. This wasn't about fame. It wasn't about the concert. It wasn't even about the letter. Jimin was breaking down because he had spent months believing that one brief conversation had created a responsibility he could never escape. And now he was standing beneath thousands of lights, realizing that sometimes telling someone to keep going is not enough. Sometimes you have to stay long enough to help them believe it. Suga slowly walked toward him. The music faded. The cameras continued recording. The entire stadium waited. Jimin looked at Suga through tears and whispered something that the microphones barely captured. "I couldn't save her." Suga stopped directly in front of him. His answer was quiet, but it carried enough weight to change everything that happened next. "Jimin, you were never supposed to save her alone." And for the first time that night, Jimin allowed himself to believe it. The words seemed almost too quiet for a stadium that large, yet somehow they reached Jimin through the noise of thousands of people. You were never supposed to save her alone. Jimin stared at Suga as if he had heard the sentence before but had never truly understood it. His breathing remained uneven. The microphone hung loosely in his hand, and the lights reflected against the tears still gathered along his lower eyelids. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then Suga reached out and gently lowered Jimin's microphone hand, not taking it away, only helping him steady it. "Look at me," he said. Jimin did. "You're here." Jimin swallowed. "She's here too. Then let's stop pretending this is something you have to carry by yourself." The audience remained unusually quiet. Some fans were crying. Others were looking toward the restricted entrance, trying to understand who Jimin had been watching throughout the night. The musicians had stopped playing completely. Even the giant screens behind the stage had gone dark, leaving only the soft glow of the stage lights around the two members. Jimin looked toward the side entrance again. Hana was still there, surrounded by security personnel and one staff member who appeared to be speaking calmly with her. She wasn't trying to get onto the stage. She wasn't causing a disturbance. She was simply crying. Jimin's expression changed when he saw her. He turned back to Suga. "She thinks she has to disappear," he whispered. "Then tell her she doesn't," Suga replied. "Not as an idol, not as someone famous, just as a person." Jimin closed his eyes briefly. "What if I say the wrong thing? Then we'll listen instead." Jimin looked at him. "We'll," Suga nodded. "We'll." That single word seemed to take some of the weight from Jimin's shoulders. Behind them, RM had already approached the production team. He spoke quietly with the stage director, asking whether the next segment could be delayed. J-Hope was coordinating with the dancers, telling them to remain off stage. Jin moved toward the side area where Hana was standing, but stopped several meters away, deliberately giving her space. Jungkook stood near the stairs, watching Jimin with an expression that had lost all trace of his usual playfulness. V remained beside the musicians, quietly asking whether the sound system could be adjusted so the audience would still hear the conversation without turning the moment into a spectacle. Nobody was trying to take control away from Jimin. They were simply creating room for him to breathe. That difference mattered. Jimin looked at the audience. Tens of thousands of faces stared back at him. He lifted the microphone again. His hand still trembled. "I'm sorry," he said. The crowd immediately answered with a wave of voices. "Don't be sorry." Jimin lowered his head. More tears fell. "I thought I could keep going." His voice cracked. "I thought if I smiled enough, nobody would notice." Suga stood beside him without interrupting. Jimin continued, "But tonight I realized something." He paused, struggling to control his breathing. "Sometimes you can tell someone they're strong, but that doesn't mean they're going to believe you." The audience became silent again. "And sometimes," Jimin said, "you can care about someone so much that you start believing their pain is your responsibility." Suga looked at him. Jimin's voice became softer. "I think I made that mistake." A few rows near the front began crying openly. Others held their light sticks close to their chests. The moment no longer felt like a concert. It felt like thousands of people witnessing a private realization that had accidentally become public. Suga leaned toward Jimin. "You don't have to tell them everything." Jimin nodded. "I know. Just tell them what you need to say." Jimin looked toward Hana again. This time she didn't look away. Their eyes met. Jimin raised the microphone. "There is someone here tonight who made me realize something." Hana immediately lowered her head. "I'm not going to say her name," Jimin continued, "and I'm not going to tell her story because it's hers, but I want her to hear one thing." His voice shook. "You don't have to disappear just because life became difficult." Hana covered her mouth. Jimin continued, "And I don't need you to become happy overnight. I don't need you to become strong tonight. I just want you to stay long enough to see what tomorrow looks like." Suga's eyes lowered for a moment. The words had affected him too. He knew Jimin wasn't only speaking to Hana anymore. He was speaking to a part of himself that had spent years believing that strength meant never letting anyone see how tired you were. The audience responded with applause, but Jimin lifted one hand, asking them to stop. "Please," he said, "don't turn this into a performance." The applause faded. "This isn't a performance." His voice was almost a whisper. "It's just a person asking another person not to give up." For several seconds, the stadium remained silent. Then Hana took one small step forward. A security guard looked toward the staff member for instructions. The staff member nodded. Hana was allowed to remain where she was. She didn't approach the stage. She didn't need to. Jimin simply saw that she was still there. Suga watched Jimin's shoulders relax slightly. The emotional pressure had not disappeared. In fact, something unexpected happened. Jimin began crying again, harder than before. He turned away from the audience and covered his face. Suga immediately stepped closer. "Hey," Jimin shook his head, "I don't know why I'm crying." "You know why? No, you finally stopped holding it in." Jimin let out a broken laugh through his tears. "That's embarrassing." Suga's expression softened. "Then be embarrassed." Jimin looked at him. "What?" "Cry, be embarrassed. Be tired, be confused. You don't have to look perfect every second." Jimin stared at him for a long moment. Then he leaned forward until his forehead briefly touched Suga's shoulder. The gesture lasted only a few seconds. It was quiet and completely unplanned. But in a stadium filled with cameras, it became the moment everyone remembered. Suga didn't hug him dramatically. He simply placed one hand on the back of Jimin's shoulder and stood there. No performance. No exaggerated reaction, just presence. Eventually Jimin stepped back. He wiped his face and took a deep breath. "I'm okay," he whispered. Suga answered immediately. "Don't say that yet." Jimin almost smiled. "Why? Because you don't have to be okay yet." That made Jimin laugh softly through the tears. It was the first genuine laugh of the night. The tension in the stadium eased slightly. The musicians began playing a quiet instrumental. But before the next song could begin, Hana suddenly turned away from the stage. Jimin noticed. "Wait." His voice came through the microphone. Hana stopped. Jimin looked toward the staff. "Can she stay?" The staff member nodded. "Yes." Jimin looked at Hana again. "You don't have to come closer." Hana nodded. "Just stay." She wiped her face. "Okay." That one word seemed to settle something inside Jimin, but there was another problem, the letter. Jimin still had not told Suga what the final line said. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out the folded paper. He stared at it. Suga noticed. "You want to tell me?" Jimin hesitated. Then he handed it over. Suga unfolded the paper carefully and read it. His expression changed. At first he said nothing. Then he read the final sentence again. Jimin watched him. "That's why I couldn't breathe," he whispered. Suga folded the paper slowly. "She wasn't saying goodbye to you." Jimin looked confused. "What? Read it again." Jimin frowned. "I already did." "No, read the last sentence." Jimin took the paper. His eyes moved across the words. He stopped. His breathing changed. Suga had noticed something Jimin hadn't because Jimin had been too emotionally involved to see it. The final sentence wasn't a farewell. It was a question. Hana had written that she had been accepted into a small performing arts program in another city, but she was afraid to go because she believed leaving meant admitting that her old life had failed. She hadn't written that she was giving up. She had written that she didn't know whether she had the courage to begin again. Jimin stared at the page. "I thought she was leaving because she gave up." Suga shook his head. "Maybe she's leaving because she's trying again." Jimin looked toward Hana. For the first time that night there was something other than fear in his expression. There was hope. Hana raised her eyes. Jimin smiled through the tears. He lifted the microphone one more time. "I think I misunderstood the letter." The crowd listened. "Sometimes when someone says they're leaving, we assume they're running away." He looked toward Hana. "But maybe they're just trying to find somewhere they can breathe." Hana began crying again. Jimin continued, "If you're watching this moment and you're afraid to start over, I hope you know something. Starting over doesn't mean you failed." Suga looked at Jimin and nodded. The members behind them remained silent. They didn't need to add anything. The message belonged to Jimin. And then, unexpectedly, Hana raised her hand. Not to wave, not to get attention. She simply held up the small acceptance letter she had been carrying all night. Jimin's eyes widened. Suga saw it too. The crowd reacted with a collective gasp. Jimin laughed through his tears. "You got accepted," Hana nodded. Jimin covered his face again, overwhelmed by the realization. The person he thought he needed to rescue had never been asking him to rescue her. She had only been afraid to take the next step. Suga leaned toward Jimin and whispered, "See." Jimin looked at him. "See what?" "Sometimes the person you think you're saving is actually reminding you how to keep going too." Jimin didn't answer. He simply looked toward Hana and smiled. But the night wasn't over. Because what none of them knew was that the letter Hana had brought to the stadium was not the only thing she had prepared. And when the next song began, she would reveal something that would force Jimin to confront a much more personal truth, one that had nothing to do with Hana's future, and everything to do with why he had been so afraid of losing her in the first place. The next song began softly, almost cautiously, as if the musicians themselves understood that the atmosphere had changed. Jimin stood beneath a single pool of warm light, still holding the microphone with both hands. The stadium remained unusually quiet. Thousands of people who had arrived expecting a concert were now witnessing something far more intimate, though almost none of them knew the full story. Jimin looked toward Hana again. She was still holding the acceptance letter against her chest, tears running down her face. But there was a small smile there now, not a triumphant smile, not the kind people give when everything suddenly becomes perfect. It was the uncertain smile of someone who had finally allowed herself to believe that another beginning might be possible. Jimin smiled back. Then he noticed something in her other hand, a small folded photograph. His expression changed immediately. Hana looked down at it, then back at him. She slowly raised it so he could see. Jimin froze. The photograph was old and slightly worn at the edges. It showed a small rehearsal room with a young woman standing in front of a mirror. Beside her was a handwritten note taped to the wall. Jimin couldn't read the words from the stage, but he recognized the room. He had seen it before. Months earlier, that had been the place where he first encountered Hana. She had been sitting outside that building after a rehearsal, exhausted and discouraged. Jimin had spoken to her for only 20 minutes, but apparently she had remembered every word. Jimin lowered his microphone. Suga noticed the expression immediately. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Jimin didn't answer. He kept looking at the photograph. Hana then pointed toward the large screen behind the stage. The production team hesitated. Nobody had been prepared for this. Hana wasn't supposed to be part of the show, but Jimin understood what she was asking. He turned toward the stage director and gave a small nod. The screen changed. At first, the audience saw darkness. Then an old video appeared. It was grainy, clearly recorded on a phone. A young woman stood alone in a rehearsal room practicing a dance routine. She made several mistakes. She stopped, took a breath, tried again. The video was not polished. There was no dramatic music, no special effects. Just a person practicing alone after everyone else had gone home. Jimin stared at the screen. His eyes filled again. He remembered the conversation. He remembered telling Hana that nobody became good at something by being fearless. They became good by returning after failure. He had forgotten the exact words. She hadn't. The video continued. Hana finished the routine, looked into the camera, and whispered, "Tomorrow I'll try again." The screen went black. For several seconds, nobody reacted. Then Jimin looked down, overwhelmed. Suga stepped beside him. "She remembered," he said. Jimin nodded. "I didn't." Suga shook his head. "You remembered, you just didn't realize it mattered." Jimin looked at him. "Why does this hurt so much?" Suga took a moment before answering. "Because you recognized yourself in her." Jimin became still. The words reached somewhere deeper than the letter had. Suga continued quietly, "You kept telling her not to give up because you know what it feels like to wonder if you're good enough." Jimin looked toward the stage floor. "Maybe. Not maybe." Suga's voice remained calm. "You don't have to be ashamed of that." Jimin took a slow breath. For years, he had learned how to perform confidence even when doubt lived underneath it. He had learned how to smile when exhausted, to reassure others when he himself needed reassurance, and to turn vulnerability into something hidden between songs. Hana had accidentally shown him what happened when someone else carried the same fear. The difference was that she had been brave enough to show it. Jimin looked toward the other members. RM stood near the side of the stage, listening. Jin had his arms folded, his expression unusually serious. J-Hope looked toward Hana with visible encouragement. Jungkook wiped his eyes quickly when he thought nobody was watching. V stood quietly near the musicians. For once, nobody was trying to fill the silence. Then Jimin raised the microphone. "I think I owe someone an apology." Hana shook her head immediately. Jimin smiled. "I know you don't think I do." He paused. "But I do." The audience remained silent. "I thought I was the one who had something to give you." Jimin looked directly at Hana. "But tonight you reminded me that sometimes people enter our lives for reasons we don't understand until much later." He lowered his eyes. "You reminded me that being afraid doesn't mean you're weak." Hana wiped her tears. "And you reminded me that starting over can be terrifying even when it's exactly what we need." Jimin's voice became unsteady. "So thank you." Hana pressed the acceptance letter against her chest. Then something unexpected happened. She turned toward the staff member beside her and handed over a small envelope. The staff member carried it toward the edge of the stage and gave it to Jimin. Jimin looked at Suga before opening it. "You knew about this?" he asked. Suga shook his head. "No." Jimin carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten page. He began reading. His expression changed almost immediately. Suga leaned slightly closer but did not try to read over his shoulder. Jimin's eyes moved slowly across the page. Then he stopped, his lips parted. "What does it say?" Suga asked. Jimin couldn't answer. He handed him the paper. Suga read it. His face became serious. It wasn't a letter thanking Jimin. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It was a list of names. People Hana had met in the months after her conversation with Jimin. A dance teacher who had given her free lessons. A musician who had let her rehearse in his studio. A cafe owner who allowed struggling performers to use a small corner of the cafe for practice. A group of young dancers who had invited her to join them. And at the bottom of the page was one sentence. "You told me I wasn't invisible. I wanted you to know that you weren't the only person who saw me." Suga looked at Jimin. For the first time that night, he had no immediate response. Jimin took the paper back. He read the sentence again. Then he laughed softly through his tears. "She did all of this." Suga nodded. "Yes, without me. That's the point." Jimin looked at him. Suga continued, "You opened a door. She walked through it. Don't take away her strength by pretending you carried her." Jimin's eyes filled again, but this time the tears were different. They were not tears of panic. They were relief. He finally understood that caring about someone did not mean becoming responsible for every step they took. Sometimes kindness was simply giving someone enough hope to take the next step themselves. Jimin turned toward the audience. "I think I've been learning something tonight." The crowd listened. "We spend so much time thinking we have to fix everything for people we love." He looked toward Suga. "Sometimes we even think that if someone hurts, we have failed." Suga's expression softened. "But maybe love isn't always fixing." Jimin continued. "Maybe sometimes it's staying close enough that the other person doesn't feel alone while they find their own way." The stadium erupted into quiet applause. Jimin smiled. He looked toward Suga. "Thank you." Suga raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For stopping me." Suga shook his head. "You stopped yourself." "No." Jimin smiled faintly. "You just stood there until I remembered how." Suga looked away for a moment, seemingly uncomfortable with the attention. Jin immediately broke the tension from the side of the stage. "Are we going to finish the concert tonight, or are we all becoming therapists?" The audience laughed. Jimin laughed too. Even Suga smiled. The heaviness finally began to lift. The musicians started playing again. The members returned to their positions. But before Jimin moved, Suga touched his arm. "One more thing." Jimin looked at him. "What?" "Don't read that letter again tonight." Jimin frowned. "Why?" "Because you already understood it." Jimin smiled. "Okay." He folded the paper carefully and handed it to a staff member for safekeeping. Hana remained in the audience area. She was no longer hiding. She was still crying, but she was smiling too. The concert continued. The choreography resumed. The lights expanded across the stadium. The members moved together again, yet something had shifted permanently. Jimin no longer looked toward the restricted entrance with fear. Every time he saw Hana, he smiled. Every time she smiled back, he seemed to breathe a little easier. Then, during the final section of the performance, Jimin and Suga stood side by side beneath the lights. Suga leaned toward him. "You okay?" Jimin thought about the question. This time, he didn't automatically say yes. He looked at the crowd, then at Hana, then at the members standing around him. "I'm getting there." Suga nodded. "That's a better answer." The song reached its final chorus. Thousands of voices joined theirs. Jimin closed his eyes for a moment and listened. For the first time that night, he wasn't trying to control what anyone thought of him. He wasn't trying to rescue anyone. He wasn't trying to prove that he was strong. He was simply standing there, surrounded by people who had chosen to stay. And yet, just as the final notes began to fade, Jimin noticed one more detail that made him stop. Hana was no longer holding the acceptance letter. Instead, she was holding the old photograph from the rehearsal room. On the back of it, someone had written a sentence Jimin had never seen before. He couldn't read it from the stage, but Hana looked directly at him and mouthed 4 words. "You should read this." Jimin's expression changed. The music faded. The lights dimmed. And once again, he realized that the night had one more secret waiting for him backstage. The final notes disappeared into the darkness, but Jimin remained standing beneath the fading lights, staring toward the place where Hana had been. The stadium erupted into applause, yet for a few seconds he seemed unable to hear any of it. He could still see the old photograph in her hands and the 4 words she had silently mouthed from the crowd. "You should read this." Suga noticed immediately. He stepped closer. "What did she say?" Jimin looked at him. "She wants me to read something." Suga nodded toward the backstage entrance. "Then we'll read it." Jimin hesitated. "You mean me?" "No," Suga replied calmly. "I mean you don't have to walk back there alone." That sentence stayed with Jimin as they left the stage. The moment they crossed behind the curtains, the enormous sound of the stadium became muffled. The atmosphere changed instantly. The bright stage lights gave way to dim-work lamps, cables, equipment cases, water bottles, towels, and staff moving quietly between rooms. Jimin stopped near a wall and finally exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for the entire second half of the concert. Suga stood beside him without saying anything. After several seconds, Jimin whispered, "I thought I was going to lose control out there." "You did," Suga said. Jimin looked at him, surprised. "Thanks." Suga gave a small smile. "You needed to." Jimin leaned against the wall. "I hate people seeing me like that." "I know. I don't want them worrying." "They already worry." Jimin laughed quietly. "That's not helpful. It's true." The backstage corridor gradually became quieter as the rest of the members finished their own transitions. RM walked past them, stopped briefly, and gave Jimin a reassuring nod. Jin squeezed his shoulder without saying anything. J-Hope smiled warmly before moving toward the dressing room. Jungkook lingered for a moment and said, "You did okay." Jimin laughed. "Okay," Jungkook shrugged. "Very emotional, very dramatic, 10 out of 10. Jimin finally smiled properly. V walked past and quietly placed a bottle of water in Jimin's hand. "Drink." Then he left before Jimin could answer. The simple gestures made Jimin's eyes become wet again, but he quickly looked away. Suga noticed. "You're going to start again." Jimin shook his head. "No, you're already crying." Jimin touched his cheek and laughed. "I hate tonight." "You'll remember it." "That's why I hate it." Suga smiled. Then Hana arrived. She was accompanied by a staff member and a security representative, but she looked calmer now. She stopped several feet away from Jimin. Neither spoke at first. The stadium continued roaring in the distance. It sounded strangely far away. Jimin finally said, "You scared me." Hana looked down. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize." Jimin took a step toward her. "I thought your letter was goodbye." "I know. Why didn't you make it clearer?" Hana gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "Because I didn't know how to say it." Jimin nodded. "Fair enough." Suga remained nearby but deliberately gave them space. Hana looked at him. "Thank you." Suga raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For stopping him." Suga glanced at Jimin. "He stopped himself." Hana smiled. "He would say that." Jimin looked between them. "You two are annoying." Hana laughed softly. The tension eased. Then she handed Jimin the old photograph. "Turn it over." Jimin did. On the back was a handwritten message. Read it once, then again. His face slowly changed. The sentence was simple. "That night you told me not to disappear. I didn't, but I want you to know that I almost did, and the reason I stayed wasn't because you saved me. It was because your words gave me enough time to find people who could help me save myself." Jimin stared at the photograph for a long time. His eyes filled. "You wrote this?" Hana nodded. "Months ago. Why didn't you give it to me?" "Because I was embarrassed." "About what?" "About needing help." Jimin looked at her. "Everyone needs help." Hana smiled sadly. "You didn't seem to." Suga let out a quiet breath. Jimin glanced at him. Suga's expression said everything. Jimin looked back at Hana. "I do." Hana seemed surprised. "You do, more than I admit." The words came naturally. No camera was pointed at him now. No audience was waiting for him to say something inspiring. There was no stage persona to maintain. Just Jimin standing in a quiet corridor admitting something he had avoided for a long time. Sometimes, he continued, I think if I tell people I'm struggling, I'll become another problem they have to worry about. Hana shook her head. That's exactly what I thought. Jimin smiled faintly. Maybe we're both terrible at asking for help. Suga finally spoke. Definitely. They both looked at him. What? Jimin asked. Suga shrugged. I'm included. The three of them laughed quietly. It was a small moment, almost ordinary, and perhaps that was what made it meaningful. The entire night had been filled with huge emotions, stadium lights, cameras, music, and thousands of people. But this quiet laugh in a backstage hallway felt more honest than anything that had happened on stage. Hana looked at Jimin again. Can I tell you something? Of course. When I first met you, I thought you were someone who had everything. Jimin smiled. I definitely don't. I know that now. She looked toward Suga. Especially after tonight, Suga nodded. Good, Hana continued, but I learned something else. People don't always need someone who has all the answers. Sometimes they just need someone who doesn't walk away. Jimin looked down. You taught me that too. The corridor became quiet again. Hana reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. The cover was worn. Several pages were bent. This is what I used when I couldn't perform anymore. She handed it to Jimin. I wrote one sentence every day. Jimin opened it. The first page read, today was difficult. The second said, I wanted to quit. The third read, I tried anyway. The sentences continued. Some were hopeful, some were angry, some simply said, I don't know. Jimin turned page after page, then he stopped at the final entry. Tomorrow I leave for the program. He looked up. Hana smiled. I'm scared. Jimin nodded. You should be. Hana laughed. That's not very encouraging. No, Jimin replied. I mean, if you're scared, it probably means it matters. Suga looked at Jimin and smiled faintly. It was the same lesson Jimin had once given Hana without realizing how deeply he believed it himself. Hana closed the notebook. I wanted you to have this. Jimin shook his head. No, you keep it. Why? Because one day you'll forget how far you've come. Hana looked at him. And then you read it. She nodded slowly. Jimin returned the notebook. There was another silence. This time nobody rushed to fill it. Suga looked toward the dressing room. We should let him breathe. Hana nodded. She stepped backward. Good luck with the rest of your tour. Jimin smiled. Good luck with your new life. Hana turned to leave. Then she stopped. Jimin, yeah, you were wrong about one thing. What? You didn't need to save me. Jimin's smile faded into something softer. I know, but you did help me. Jimin nodded. Thank you. She walked away. Jimin watched until she disappeared around the corner. Then he leaned against the wall again. Suga stood beside him. Neither spoke for almost a minute. Finally, Jimin whispered, I think I understand why I broke down. Suga looked at him. Why? Because I thought caring meant carrying everything. Suga nodded. And now? Jimin looked toward the hallway where Hana had disappeared. Now I think caring means knowing when to put something down. Suga smiled. That's probably the smartest thing you've said all night. Jimin laughed. Don't get used to it. They started walking toward the dressing room, but halfway there Jimin stopped. Suga. Thank you for coming toward me. Suga turned around. What else was I supposed to do? Jimin looked at him. You could have stayed back. Suga shook his head. No. Why? Suga thought for a moment. Because sometimes people don't need advice. They just need someone to stand beside them until they can stand again. Jimin's eyes became wet. You really know how to say things at the worst possible time. Suga smiled. Occupational hazard. Jimin laughed. Then, without thinking too much about it, he leaned briefly against Suga's shoulder. This time there were no cameras, no audience, no dramatic music, just two friends standing in a quiet hallway after a difficult night. Eventually they returned to the dressing room. The other members were there waiting. Nobody asked for details. Jin simply pushed a plate toward Jimin. Eat. Jimin looked at it. I'm not hungry. Everyone stared at him. Jimin sighed. Fine. Jungkook smiled. Good choice. RM leaned back in his chair. You okay? Jimin paused. He looked at Suga, then at the others. I'm getting there. RM nodded. That's enough. The room became quieter. For the first time that night, Jimin realized he wasn't surrounded by people waiting for him to be strong. He was surrounded by people willing to stay while he wasn't. And somewhere outside the dressing room, Hana was preparing to leave the stadium with her acceptance letter, carrying the same fear she had arrived with, but now carrying something else too. Not certainty, not a promise that everything would work out, just enough courage to take the next step. The concert had ended, but the consequences of that night were only beginning. Because the next morning, a short video of Jimin crying on stage would spread across the internet, and millions of people would see a moment they believed was about one thing. They would not know the real story. They would not know about Hana, the letter, the photograph, or the quiet conversation backstage. And Jimin would soon have to decide whether protecting someone's privacy was more important than explaining why he had broken down in front of an entire stadium. By the time the first morning light reached the hotel windows, the video had already spread far beyond the stadium. Clips of Jimin wiping his tears, Suga walking toward him, and the two standing together beneath the lights appeared across social media within hours. Fans replayed the moment frame by frame, searching for an explanation in every expression, every pause, every movement of Suga's hand on Jimin's shoulder. Some believed Jimin had simply become overwhelmed by the concert. Others thought something had happened backstage. A few noticed the woman near the restricted entrance and began asking questions, but nobody outside that small circle knew the truth. Inside the hotel, Jimin sat silently at the edge of a sofa, his phone face down beside him. He had already seen enough. Headlines were appearing everywhere. People were speculating about his tears. Some were worried. Some were emotional. Others were trying to reconstruct the entire night from blurry audience recordings. Jimin rubbed his face and whispered, "This is getting bigger than it should." Suga was sitting across from him, drinking coffee. "Then don't make it bigger." Jimin looked up. "How? Don't explain what isn't yours to explain." Jimin stared at the floor. He knew exactly what Suga meant. Hana's story belonged to her. The public didn't need to know why she had come to the concert, what she had struggled with, or where she was going next. Yet there was another side to the problem. If Jimin remained completely silent, people might continue creating stories that could hurt her. The manager entered the room with a tablet in hand. "We're getting a lot of questions," Jimin sighed. "About me? About the moment," the manager hesitated. "And about the person people think they saw near the stage." Jimin's expression became serious. "Don't confirm anything." "That's what I thought." The manager nodded. "But some reporters are already asking whether there was a private incident." Jimin looked at Suga. "What do you think?" Suga didn't answer immediately. "What do you want?" Jimin considered the question. "I want people to stop guessing." "Then say something without telling them her story." Jimin looked down at his hands. "What if they don't believe me?" Suga shrugged. "They don't have to." Jimin looked at him. "That's easy for you to say." "No, it isn't." Suga put down his cup. "People will always want an explanation. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is accept that they won't get one." Jimin remained silent. The room became quiet. Then his phone vibrated. It was a message from Hana. He hesitated before opening it. "I'm okay, please don't worry, I left safely." A second message followed. "Thank you for last night, I think I can go now." Jimin read it twice. His eyes became wet. Suga noticed. "She's okay?" Jimin nodded. "She says she's leaving today." "For the program?" "Yes." Suga smiled. "Then let her go." Jimin stared at the message. "I think I'm finally learning how." Later that afternoon, the members gathered for a short rehearsal. The atmosphere was lighter than the previous day, but Jimin was still distracted. During a break, Jungkook approached him. "You know, everyone thinks Suga saved you." Jimin laughed. "What? Online, they're making edits." Jimin shook his head. "That's not what happened." Jungkook smiled. "I know." He paused. "But he did save you a little." Jimin looked towards Suga, who was talking to RM across the room. "Maybe." Jungkook became serious. "I think we all do that sometimes." Jimin looked at him. "What? Stand close enough so someone remembers they're not alone." Jimin smiled. "You learned that from somewhere," Jungkook shrugged. "Maybe from you." The word stayed with Jimin. The rehearsal resumed. Later, the members prepared to leave for the next venue. As Jimin walked through the corridor, he saw a staff member holding a small package. "This came for you." Jimin looked at the label, no sender. He opened it carefully. Inside was Hana's old rehearsal photograph. On the back, beneath the sentence he had already read, there was now another line. "You were right, tomorrow came." Jimin stared at it. He smiled. Then he turned the photograph over again. On the front, Hana was standing in the rehearsal room, looking exhausted but determined. Jimin suddenly realized why the image affected him so deeply. It wasn't because he had saved her. It was because the photograph reminded him of a version of himself that he had forgotten. a younger version who had once stood in empty rooms, wondering whether his dreams were worth the pain they demanded. He remembered failed auditions, long rehearsals, moments when he questioned whether he belonged. He remembered learning to smile through disappointment. He remembered the fear of being judged. And suddenly the story wasn't only about Hana anymore. It was about every person who had ever believed they were falling behind while everyone else seemed to move forward. That evening, Jimin asked the production team for a few minutes alone on stage before the next performance. The stadium was nearly empty. A few technicians were working beneath the seats. The enormous venue looked completely different without the audience. Rows of empty chairs stretched into darkness. Jimin stood at center stage, looking at the floor where his tears had fallen the night before. Suga walked onto the stage behind him. "You called," Jimin smiled. "I wanted to see this without all the noise." Suga stood beside him. "Different. Very." Jimin looked around. "Last night it felt like the whole world was watching." Suga nodded. "And now," Jimin took a breath, "now it feels small." "That's because it is." Jimin looked at him. "Do you ever think about how strange our lives are?" "Constantly. Thousands of people watching us, but sometimes we don't know how to talk to the person standing right beside us." Suga smiled faintly. "That's probably why the quiet moments matter." Jimin nodded. They stood there in silence. Then Jimin said, "I think I was afraid that if Hana left it would prove I had failed." Suga looked at him. "Why?" "Because I told her to stay." "She did. But she didn't stay here." Suga shook his head. "You keep confusing staying with remaining in the same place." Jimin became still. "That's what I was doing." "Yes." Suga looked toward the empty seats. "Sometimes moving forward looks like leaving." Jimin's eyes filled again. "You know, I thought the hardest part was seeing her struggle, and now the hardest part was realizing I couldn't control what happened next." Suga nodded. "That's adulthood." Jimin laughed quietly. "That's depressing." "It's also freedom." Jimin looked at him. "How?" "Because once you accept that you can't control everything, you can finally stop blaming yourself for everything." Jimin lowered his head. Those words landed with the force of something he had needed to hear for years. He sat on the edge of the stage. Suga sat beside him. "I don't want to forget last night," Jimin said. "You won't." "I don't mean the embarrassment," Suga smiled. "I know. I mean the feeling." "Which one?" Jimin looked toward the empty stadium. "The feeling that people can fall apart and still be surrounded by kindness." Suga nodded. "Then remember that." Jimin sat quietly for another moment. Suddenly, the stage lights flickered on. A technician testing the system accidentally illuminated the entire arena. The empty seats appeared one by one in the soft light. Jimin looked around and smiled. "It doesn't look so frightening now." Suga stood. "It never was." Jimin looked at him. "You sure?" Suga extended his hand. "Come on." Jimin took it. They walked toward the center of the stage together. There, beneath the same lights that had witnessed Jimin's breakdown the night before, they stood without an audience. No cameras, no screams, no expectations, just silence. Jimin looked at Suga and said, "If I cry again," Suga shrugged, "then I'll wait. And if I can't talk, I'll wait longer." Jimin smiled. "What if you get tired?" Suga looked at him seriously. "Then I'll sit down." Jimin laughed. "That's your big answer." "Yes." Jimin shook his head. "You're impossible." Suga smiled. "And you're still here." Jimin looked around the empty arena. "Yeah." He took a deep breath. "I'm still here." For a few seconds neither moved. Then Jimin's eyes filled again. This time he didn't wipe the tears away. He let them fall. Suga didn't say anything. He simply remained beside him. And perhaps that was the real climax of the story. Not the moment thousands of fans saw Jimin cry, not the moment Suga walked toward him, not even the discovery of Hana's acceptance letter. It was the quiet realization afterward that neither of them needed to fix the other. They only needed to remain present. Outside the stadium, the city continued moving. Cars passed. People walked home. Fans shared clips online. Reporters wrote headlines. Somewhere on a train leaving the city, Hana sat beside a window with her acceptance letter folded carefully inside her bag. She looked out at the buildings disappearing behind her and opened the notebook she had carried for months. On a blank page, she wrote one final sentence before closing it. "Today I stopped waiting for someone to save me." She paused, then added another line. "And I finally understood that being helped is not the same as being helpless." Meanwhile, back inside the empty stadium, Jimin looked at Suga. "Do you think she'll make it?" Suga answered without hesitation. "No," Jimin looked surprised. "What?" Suga smiled. "I think she'll struggle, she'll fail sometimes, she'll doubt herself, she'll probably want to quit again." Jimin listened. "But she'll know how to begin again." Jimin nodded slowly. "That's better." Suga looked toward the empty seats. "Much better." They walked off stage together. Neither knew that months later, Hana would return to that same city for her first professional performance. Neither knew that she would keep the old photograph in the pocket of her costume. Neither knew that one day she would send Jimin a message containing only 3 words: "I didn't disappear." And neither could have known that those 3 words would bring Jimin to tears again, but for an entirely different reason. Months passed before the night began to feel like something that belonged to the past, but for Jimin, the memory never completely disappeared. The internet moved on quickly, as it always did. New performances replaced old clips. New headlines replaced old speculation. The short video of Jimin crying on stage eventually became one more emotional moment buried beneath millions of other moments. Most people who had watched it never learned the real story. They didn't know about Hana's acceptance letter. They didn't know about the photograph. They didn't know that Suga had spent the entire night standing close enough for Jimin to lean on him without ever asking for an explanation. And perhaps that was exactly how it should have been. Some stories belong to the people who lived them. Jimin returned to his schedule, rehearsals, recordings, travel, performances, interviews, and long hours inside rooms where the outside world could disappear for a while. From the outside, everything looked normal again, but internally something had changed. He began noticing small things he had once ignored. When a dancer looked unusually quiet during rehearsal, Jimin asked if they were okay instead of assuming they were simply tired. When a staff member stayed late, he would leave food nearby without making a big announcement about it. When another performer made a mistake and apologized repeatedly, Jimin would tell them, "You don't have to be perfect to belong here." Sometimes the people around him smiled because they knew exactly where those words had come from. Suga noticed the change too. One evening in a recording studio, Jimin was listening to a rough vocal track when he suddenly stopped the playback. "Something's missing." Suga looked up from his laptop. "What's missing?" "I don't know." Jimin replayed the track. "It sounds technically fine." "Then why stop?" Jimin thought for a moment. "Because it sounds like I'm trying too hard to sound okay." Suga smiled faintly. "Maybe you're learning." Jimin looked at him. "You think? You're starting to notice the difference between sounding strong and actually feeling strong." Jimin nodded. The conversation ended there. Neither needed to explain it further. In another city, Hana's life had changed too. The performing arts program wasn't easy. The first few weeks were brutal. She struggled with new routines, unfamiliar teachers, financial pressure, and the quiet loneliness of starting over somewhere nobody knew her name. She failed an audition, then another. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult rehearsal, she sat alone on the floor and stared at her shoes. For a moment, the old thought returned. Maybe this had been a mistake. Maybe she should leave. Maybe she had misunderstood every encouraging word people had ever given her. Then she opened her notebook. The pages were filled with the same imperfect handwriting. Today was difficult. I wanted to quit. I tried anyway. She turned to the final page. The words she had written before leaving the city stared back at her. Today I stopped waiting for someone to save me. She closed the notebook and stood. She went back into the rehearsal room. Nobody knew that she had nearly walked away that afternoon. Nobody knew that she had stayed because of a sentence she had once heard from someone she barely knew. And that was the strange thing about kindness. The person who gives it may forget the moment. The person who receives it may carry it for years. Months later, Hana performed on a small stage in front of a few hundred people. It wasn't a huge venue. There were no massive screens, no thousands of light sticks, no cameras broadcasting the performance around the world. There was simply a wooden stage, warm lights, nervous performers, and an audience sitting close enough to see every expression. Before going on stage, Hana reached into her costume pocket and touched the old photograph. She smiled. Then she stepped onto the stage. She made one mistake during the second piece. Nobody laughed. She kept going. Her hands shook during the final sequence. She kept going. When the music ended, she stood beneath the lights and bowed. The applause wasn't enormous, but it was real. Hana closed her eyes for 1 second and breathed. She had done it, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but honestly. Afterward, she sat backstage with her phone in her hands. She stared at Jimin's contact information for several minutes. She wasn't sure whether she should message him. She didn't want to disturb him. She didn't want to make the night about herself again. Eventually, she typed 3 words. "I didn't disappear." She stared at the message, then she sent it. Thousands of miles away, Jimin's phone vibrated during a quiet evening. He looked down. When he read the message, he became completely still. Suga was nearby. "What happened?" Jimin handed him the phone. Suga read the message and smiled. "There you go." Jimin's eyes filled with tears. "I thought she might quit. She probably thought about it." "Yeah, and she stayed," Jimin nodded. "She did." He wiped his face. "I'm proud of her." Suga handed the phone back. "Tell her," Jimin typed a response. He didn't write a long paragraph. He didn't try to give advice. He simply wrote, "I knew you would find your way." Then he paused before adding, "Keep going." Hana replied several minutes later, "I will." The exchange ended there. It didn't need to become anything bigger. It was enough. Back in their own world, the members gradually learned the full meaning of that night through Jimin's perspective. One evening, they were sitting together after rehearsal when Jin suddenly asked, "Do you remember that concert?" Jimin smiled. Unfortunately, everyone laughed. Jungkook said, "You cried so much." Jimin pointed at him. "You cried too." "I had emotional support reasons." "What does that even mean?" Jungkook laughed. RM leaned forward. "I think that night changed all of us a little." J-Hope nodded. "It reminded me how easy it is to miss what someone is carrying." V looked at Jimin. "And how sometimes the quietest person in the room needs someone to ask twice." Suga listened without speaking. Jimin looked around the room. "I don't think I would have understood any of this without you guys." Jin smiled. "Then you owe us dinner," Jimin laughed. "Of course that's where you take it." The room filled with laughter. But beneath the humor was something real. They had seen Jimin vulnerable. They had seen Suga respond without hesitation. They had seen how a private struggle could suddenly become public. And they had learned that friendship wasn't always about having the perfect words. Sometimes it was about noticing a change in someone's breathing. Sometimes it was leaving a door open. Sometimes it was sitting beside someone when they had no idea what to say. For ARMY, the aftermath looked different. Some fans who had watched the original footage began sharing their own stories of difficult moments. People wrote about leaving jobs, starting over, recovering from failure, returning to school, trying again after rejection, or simply making it through another day. The original video had been about Jimin crying, but gradually the conversation became about why people cry at all. Some fans admitted they had spent years believing that asking for help was weakness. Others talked about friends who had quietly disappeared from their lives because nobody had noticed they were struggling. A small online movement began around a simple phrase, "Stay long enough to see tomorrow." It wasn't an official campaign. Nobody controlled it. Fans simply used the words to encourage each other. One person posted the phrase beneath a photo of a graduation. Another used it after completing physical therapy. Someone else wrote it beside a picture of their first apartment after leaving a difficult home. It spread quietly. No dramatic announcement, no official endorsement, just thousands of ordinary people recognizing themselves in a sentence spoken during one fictional night on stage. Jimin eventually heard about it. When a staff member showed him a collection of messages, he stared at the screen for a long time. They made this into something beautiful. Suga looked over his shoulder. They did. Jimin smiled. "I didn't expect that." "Neither did I." Jimin scrolled through the messages. One said, "I stayed." Another said, "I started again." Another simply read, "Tomorrow came." Jimin closed his eyes. "That's enough." Suga nodded, but not every consequence was positive. There were still people who criticized Jimin for crying publicly. Some called the moment unnecessary. Others accused the story of being staged, even though nobody outside the inner circle knew what had actually happened. Jimin read some of those comments once and then stopped. Suga noticed. "Don't read them. I know." "Then why do you?" Jimin smiled weakly. "Habit." Suga closed the laptop. "Break the habit." Jimin nodded. "I'm trying." The real lesson of the night wasn't that vulnerability would always be understood. It wouldn't. Some people would misunderstand, some would judge, some would invent explanations, but Jimin had learned that being misunderstood was not always worse than being silent. He could choose privacy without shame. He could protect another person's story without carrying responsibility for their entire life. He could admit that he was hurting without needing to explain every detail, and Suga, in his own quiet way, continued reminding him of that. One evening, months after the concert, Jimin walked into a rehearsal room and found Suga sitting alone in the dark. "Why are the lights off?" Jimin asked. "Saving electricity. You're ridiculous." Jimin turned on one light and sat beside him. "You okay?" Suga looked at him. "Yeah," Jimin smiled. "Are you sure?" Suga paused. "I'm getting there," Jimin laughed. "You stole my answer. It's a good answer." They sat quietly. Then Jimin said, "You know what I learned?" "What?" "Sometimes asking if someone is okay isn't about getting the truth immediately." Suga nodded. "It's about making sure they know you'll ask again." Jimin looked at him. "Exactly." Suga smiled. Outside the room, the rest of the members were beginning another rehearsal. Music started in the distance. The world continued moving. Jimin stood and offered Suga his hand. "Come on." Suga looked at it. "Where?" "Back to work." Suga took his hand and stood. "Okay." They walked out together. Neither of them knew what the next difficult day would bring, but they no longer believed they had to face every difficult day alone. And somewhere far away, Hana was preparing for another performance, still carrying the old photograph in her bag, not as proof that someone had saved her, but as a reminder that one ordinary conversation could become the beginning of a life-changing decision. The night Jimin cried had ended months ago, yet its quietest message remained. People rarely know how far a small act of kindness will travel after it leaves their hands. A year after that night, almost nobody talked about the original concert anymore. The stadium had hosted countless performances since then. Different artists had stood beneath the same lights. Different crowds had filled the same seats. The stage floor had been cleaned, repaired, and used again so many times that there was no physical trace left of the moment when Jimin had lowered his microphone and cried. Yet the memory remained in places nobody could photograph. It lived in a rehearsal room where a young dancer decided not to quit after making the same mistake 20 times. It lived in a small theater where Hana stood backstage before another performance, touching the old photograph inside her bag. It lived in messages exchanged between strangers who had never met but had somehow found the courage to tell each other, "Stay long enough to see tomorrow." And it lived quietly inside Jimin and Suga, who never needed to discuss that night often because they both understood what it had changed. Hana's life had continued in a direction she could never have predicted. The performing arts program had not transformed her overnight. There were still difficult days. She still failed auditions. She still struggled financially. She still questioned whether she belonged. But the difference was that she no longer interpreted difficulty as proof that she should disappear. She began helping younger performers who reminded her of herself. Sometimes she stayed late after rehearsals to help someone practice. Sometimes she simply listened. She never told them that she knew exactly what they were feeling. She had learned that pretending to have all the answers could make someone feel even more alone. Instead, she would say, "I don't know how this ends either, but you don't have to figure it out tonight." One evening, after a rehearsal, a teenage performer named Mina approached her. "Can I ask you something?" Hana looked up from her bag. "Sure." "What do you do when you're scared you're not good enough?" Hana smiled faintly. "I get scared." Mina waited. "That's it?" "No." Hana closed her notebook. "Then I go back the next day." Mina looked confused. "Even if you still feel scared, especially then?" The answer came from a place deeper than advice. Hana had once been the person sitting outside a rehearsal room, convinced that leaving would be easier. Now she was the person sitting beside someone else, telling them they didn't have to make a permanent decision on their worst day. The cycle had continued, not because Jimin had rescued her, not because Suga had solved anything, but because one small act of compassion had given her enough time to find other people who could help her build a life. Jimin learned about Hana's work months later through a short message from her. She told him she had started helping young performers. He read the message during a rehearsal break and smiled. Suga noticed. "Good news, Hana, how is she?" She's helping other people now, Suga smiled. Of course she is. Jimin looked down at his phone. She says one of the younger performers reminds her of herself. Suga nodded. That's how it works. What does? Pain. If you survive it, sometimes you learn how to recognize it in other people. Jimin thought about that, and then you decide whether to walk past it. Jimin looked at him. You always make everything sound simple, Suga smiled. It's not simple, it's just clear. Their lives continued moving in parallel with thousands of other lives. Concerts came and went. Songs were recorded. Rehearsals stretched late into the night. There were flights, interviews, quiet dinners, crowded hallways, and long periods when everyone was too tired to speak. But Jimin began to carry the lesson from that night into his everyday interactions. He became more attentive to the people around him. Not dramatically. He didn't turn every encounter into an emotional conversation. Sometimes it was simply noticing when someone stopped participating in a joke. Sometimes it was asking a dancer whether they wanted to take 5 more minutes. Sometimes it was sitting beside a staff member who looked exhausted without forcing them to talk. Suga noticed these changes but rarely commented on them. One evening, Jimin found a young stage technician sitting alone near an equipment case. The technician looked nervous. Jimin sat beside him. First tour, the young man nodded. Yeah, you okay? I'm fine, Jimin smiled. You don't have to say that. The technician looked surprised. What? You can say you're overwhelmed. The young man laughed nervously. I'm overwhelmed. Good, Jimin smiled. Now we can work with the truth. From several meters away, Suga watched the interaction. He smiled quietly and returned to his notes. He knew Jimin had understood something important. Compassion wasn't always about solving someone's problem. Sometimes it was about making honesty feel safe. The same lesson began appearing in the fandom. The phrase from that night continued to evolve. Stay long enough to see tomorrow became something fans wrote on handwritten signs, notebooks, bracelets, and letters. Some used it during difficult academic periods. Some wrote it after losing jobs. Some shared it with friends recovering from heartbreak or disappointment. It wasn't associated with one person anymore. It had become a reminder that belonged to everyone who needed it. Jimin once saw a photograph of 2 fans holding a small banner with the words during a concert. He stared at it for several seconds. Look, he showed Suga. Suga read the banner. They still use it. Yeah, Jimin smiled. I wonder if they know where it came from. Suga shrugged. Maybe it doesn't matter. Jimin nodded. You're right. That was perhaps the strangest part of the entire story. The words no longer belonged to the night that created them. They belonged to the people who needed them. And that was a form of legacy neither Jimin nor Suga had expected. Months later, Hana received an invitation to perform at a larger theater. It wasn't an enormous venue, but it was the biggest stage she had ever stood on. The night before the performance, she almost called Jimin. She didn't. She didn't want the event to depend on whether he knew about it. She wanted to stand there because she had chosen to. Still, before leaving her apartment, she placed the old photograph inside her bag. On the back was the sentence that had once changed everything. You were never supposed to save me alone. Hana had added another line beneath it herself. And I was never supposed to walk alone. The next evening, she stepped onto the stage. The lights were brighter than she expected. Her hands trembled. She looked toward the audience. For a moment the old fear returned, then she breathed. The music began, she danced. She made one small mistake. She recovered, she continued. When the performance ended, the audience stood and applauded. Hana bowed. Tears in her eyes, not because everything had become easy, but because she remembered how close she had once been to walking away. After the show, she sat backstage and opened her phone. She finally sent Jimin a photograph of the stage. Under it, she wrote, "Tonight I performed on the biggest stage of my life." Jimin saw the message later that night. He smiled so widely that Suga noticed immediately. What? Jimin showed him the photograph. Suga studied it. She did well. She did. Did you tell her? I will. Jimin typed a message, then stopped. What should I say? Suga looked at him. Don't make it about you. Jimin laughed. I know, he typed again. I'm proud of you, not because you made it here, but because you kept choosing to return. He sent it. Hana responded almost immediately. I learned that from you. Jimin stared at the screen. Suga glanced over. Don't take the credit. Jimin smiled. I'm not. He looked toward the dark window. I'm just grateful. Years could pass, and the details might fade. Jimin might forget the exact words he had spoken on stage. Suga might forget the sequence of the songs. Hana might forget the color of the lights, but they would remember the feeling. The feeling of a person being seen when they expected to disappear. The feeling of someone standing beside you without demanding that you become okay immediately. The feeling of discovering that compassion did not mean taking control of another person's life. It meant respecting their struggle while refusing to treat them as invisible, and perhaps that was why the night continued to matter. It had begun as a frightening misunderstanding. Jimin thought someone was saying goodbye. Suga thought Jimin was carrying something he could not carry alone. Hana thought she was asking whether she had the courage to leave. The audience thought they were witnessing a celebrity break down. Everyone saw a different story. But underneath all of them was the same human question. What do we do when someone we care about is hurting? There is no universal answer. Sometimes you speak. Sometimes you listen. Sometimes you ask again. Sometimes you step back. Sometimes you stay. And sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is remind someone that their future belongs to them. Jimin never became responsible for Hana's life. Hana never became dependent on Jimin's approval. Suga never became the hero of the story. The other members never needed to take over. Each person simply did what they could in the moment. That was why the outcome felt real. Nobody fixed everything. Nobody erased the pain. Nobody guaranteed a perfect ending. They simply created enough space for someone to take another step, and another, and another. Years later, when people asked Jimin about moments that had changed his perspective, he rarely mentioned the concert directly. He would talk about people he had met, conversations he had forgotten until they returned unexpectedly, and the importance of noticing what people don't say. If someone asked Suga about friendship, he often gave short answers. "You don't have to solve someone else's life," he once said. "Just don't make them feel like they have to solve it alone." That sentence was never connected publicly to the concert. It didn't need to be. It was simply something he believed. Hana eventually became a mentor to young performers. She kept the old photograph, but its meaning changed over time. At first, it reminded her of the night she nearly disappeared. Later, it reminded her of the night she chose to stay. Eventually, it became something even simpler, proof that people can enter our lives briefly and still leave behind something lasting. Jimin kept a small copy of the photograph too. He never displayed it publicly. It remained inside a notebook in a drawer tucked between pages of unfinished lyrics and handwritten ideas. Sometimes he would find it accidentally and smile. He no longer saw the person he had failed to save. He saw the person who had taught him that he didn't need to save everyone. He only needed to care honestly, respect boundaries, and stay human. And perhaps that was the real legacy of the night Jimin cried on stage. Not the viral footage, not the headlines, not the speculation, not the tears themselves. The legacy was quieter. A young performer stayed. A frightened artist began again. A group of friends learned to notice one another more carefully. Thousands of strangers found words for feelings they had struggled to express. And Jimin and Suga discovered that sometimes the strongest response to someone's pain isn't a speech, a solution, or a promise. Sometimes it is simply standing beside them and saying, without needing an audience to hear it, "I'm here. Take your time." Years later, the details of that night had become softer around the edges, the way memories often do when enough time passes. Jimin could no longer remember every light cue, every song transition, or every exact word spoken backstage, but he remembered the silence that came after his voice broke. He remembered looking into the crowd and realizing that thousands of people could be watching him, and yet the most important thing happening in that moment had nothing to do with being seen. It was about finally allowing himself to stop pretending. He remembered Suga walking toward him when he was afraid to move, not because Suga had some perfect solution, but because he understood that sometimes a person doesn't need to be pulled out of their pain. They simply need someone willing to stand near them while they find their footing. And perhaps that was why the memory remained important long after the concert itself had faded. Jimin had once believed that strength meant continuing no matter what. He had thought that if he could smile, perform, reassure everyone around him, and keep moving, then he was protecting the people who depended on him. But that night taught him something much harder to accept. Strength could also mean admitting that something hurt. It could mean letting someone see the moment when the carefully constructed image of being okay finally cracked. It could mean saying, "I don't know what to do," and trusting that another person would not think less of you because of it. Suga understood that before Jimin did. He didn't try to turn the moment into a speech. He didn't tell Jimin to stop crying. He didn't tell him to be strong. He simply stayed. That choice became more meaningful with time because it revealed something about friendship that people often overlook. Friendship isn't always loud. Sometimes it is a hand resting quietly against someone's shoulder. Sometimes it is noticing a change in someone's voice before they notice it themselves. Sometimes it is asking the same question twice because the first answer sounds rehearsed. Sometimes it is knowing when to speak and when silence is kinder. And sometimes it is accepting that you cannot fix the person you love while still refusing to abandon them. Hana learned a similar lesson from the opposite direction. She had once believed that needing help made her weak. She thought accepting kindness meant becoming dependent on the person who offered it. But eventually she understood the difference between being rescued and being supported. Being rescued suggests that someone else controls the ending. Being supported means you still have the freedom to choose what happens next. That distinction changed her life. She continued performing. She continued failing. She continued learning. She became someone who could sit beside another frightened performer and say, "You don't have to know what happens next. Just decide what you will do today." Her story never became perfect. There were days when she doubted herself again. There were performances she disliked. There were opportunities she lost. There were mornings when getting out of bed felt harder than she wanted to admit, but she no longer saw those moments as proof that she had returned to the beginning. She understood that progress was not a straight line. Sometimes moving forward meant resting. Sometimes it meant changing direction. Sometimes it meant asking for help before the situation became unbearable. And sometimes it meant beginning again without announcing to anyone that you had nearly given up. Jimin carried that understanding too. He became less afraid of conversations that didn't have immediate answers. When someone told him they were struggling, he didn't rush to offer a solution. He listened. When a staff member apologized for making a mistake, he didn't immediately say everything was fine. He asked what had happened. When someone looked uncomfortable receiving praise, he didn't force them to accept it. He simply reminded them that their effort had been noticed. These were small changes. Nobody would have called them dramatic, but perhaps that was the point. Real change rarely arrives with music in the background. It happens in quiet rooms, in unfinished conversations, in ordinary moments when someone chooses patience instead of judgment. Suga continued to be Suga, quiet, observant, occasionally blunt, and often uncomfortable with emotional attention. But Jimin understood his silences differently now. He knew that Suga's quietness did not mean indifference. Sometimes it meant the opposite. It meant he was paying attention. One evening, long after the original concert, Jimin and Suga sat together in a nearly empty practice room. The lights were low. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Neither had spoken for several minutes. Jimin looked at the old photograph resting on the table between them. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked. Suga looked at the photograph. "Sometimes." "What do you remember?" Suga thought for a moment. "You crying," Jimin laughed. "Of course." "And you saying you couldn't save her." Jimin's smile faded slightly. "Yeah. I remember thinking you were trying to take responsibility for something that was never yours." Jimin nodded. "I was." "And now?" Jimin looked at the photograph. "Now I think I was scared of losing someone because I didn't know how to accept that people can leave your life without it meaning you failed them." Suga nodded. "That's better." Jimin smiled. "You always say that because you keep learning." Jimin looked out the window. "Do you think people ever completely stop being afraid?" Suga shook his head. "No." "Then what's the point?" Suga looked at him. "You learn what to do while you're afraid." Jimin became quiet. Outside, the rain continued. The answer was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they had learned. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was deciding that fear did not get to make every decision. Jimin looked back at the photograph. "I think that's what Hana taught me," Suga nodded. "And what did you teach her?" Jimin smiled. "Maybe nothing." Suga shook his head. Don't underestimate small moments. Jimin looked at him. You really think 20 minutes can change someone's life? Sometimes 20 minutes is all someone needs to decide to stay for another day. Jimin looked down. His eyes became slightly wet. He smiled. You know, you should write these things down. Suga laughed. Absolutely not. Jimin laughed too. The moment passed naturally. There was no need for a dramatic ending. The room remained quiet. The rain continued. Somewhere down the hall, a staff member called their names, reminding them that rehearsal was about to begin again. Jimin stood and picked up the photograph. He carefully placed it back inside his notebook. Ready? Suga asked. Jimin nodded. Yeah, he paused. Actually, Suga looked at him. What? Jimin smiled. I'm getting there, Suga laughed. Still using that answer. It's still true. They walked out of the room together. And maybe that was the most honest ending possible. Not that everything was healed forever. Not that nobody would ever cry again. Not that every struggle would suddenly have a solution. Life doesn't work that way. People still lose confidence. Friends still misunderstand each other. Dreams still fail. Plans still change. Some people leave. Others return. Sometimes the person who looks strongest is the one quietly asking for someone to notice. Sometimes the person you think needs saving is actually searching for the courage to save themselves. And sometimes, without realizing it, you become part of someone's story through a conversation so ordinary that you forget it happened. Years later, they may remember it perfectly. They may carry your words into a room you will never enter. They may repeat something you once said to another person who needs to hear it. That is how kindness travels. It doesn't always come back to you. It doesn't always carry your name. Sometimes it disappears into another person's life and becomes something completely different. A decision, a friendship, a new beginning, a reason to stay. The night Jimin broke down on stage had looked enormous from the outside. Thousands of people watched. Cameras recorded. The internet reacted. Headlines appeared. But the heart of the story was remarkably small. It was one person admitting they were afraid. Another person choosing not to walk away. A young woman finding the courage to begin again. And a group of friends learning that sometimes the most meaningful thing they can give one another is not an answer, but permission to be human. Jimin never needed to become responsible for Hana's future. Suga never needed to become Jimin's savior. Hana never needed to prove that she had overcome everything. They only needed to keep moving honestly through whatever came next. And perhaps that is what makes a moment like this worth remembering. Not because tears are beautiful and not because pain should be romanticized, but because vulnerability can sometimes reveal the connections that were already there. The hand that reaches out, the person who waits, the friend who notices, the stranger who listens, the performer who chooses to return to the stage. The audience member who quietly decides to keep going after the lights go out. We often imagine that changing someone's life requires something enormous. A grand gesture, a perfect speech, a dramatic rescue, but sometimes it is much smaller. Sometimes it is 20 minutes outside a rehearsal room. Sometimes it is a sentence spoken without knowing whether it will matter. Sometimes it is simply looking at someone who is struggling and refusing to look away. And if there was one thing Jimin carried from that night, it was not the embarrassment of crying in front of thousands of people. It was the understanding that he didn't have to hide every wound in order to deserve love. Suga carried a different lesson, that being there for someone does not require taking control of their life. Hana carried perhaps the most important lesson of all, that starting again does not erase what happened before. It means deciding that what happened before will not be the only thing that defines what comes next. The stadium eventually emptied. The lights eventually turned off. The cameras were packed away. The cables were rolled up. The staff went home. The crowd disappeared into the night. On the stage where everything had once felt impossibly loud, there was finally silence. And if someone had stood there alone after everyone left, they would have seen nothing extraordinary. Just an empty stage beneath a few remaining work lights. But sometimes ordinary places hold extraordinary memories. A stage can become a place where someone realizes they are allowed to cry. A hallway can become the place where two friends finally say what they were afraid to admit. A small photograph can become proof that a person who once wanted to disappear chose, instead, to begin again. And a single moment of compassion can travel farther than anyone involved could ever imagine. So perhaps the question isn't why Jimin cried that night. Perhaps the more important question is what happened because he allowed himself to cry. What changed because Suga walked toward him instead of standing back? What changed because Hana decided not to disappear? And what might change in the life of someone watching this story right now who has been silently carrying something they believe they must carry alone? Maybe you don't need to solve everything tonight. Maybe you don't need to know exactly where your life is going. Maybe you only need to take the next honest step. And if you are the person standing beside someone who is struggling, maybe you don't need the perfect words either. You can simply stay. Listen. Ask again. Give them room. Respect their choices. Remind them that their future still belongs to them. Because sometimes the most powerful thing one human being can say to another is not, "I will fix everything." It is much simpler. You don't have to face this moment alone. And maybe, somewhere in the quiet after the lights go out, that is enough to help someone believe in tomorrow.